Little Follies, Do Clams Bite? The preface begins. And it begins with an epigraph from Dylan Thomas's Reminiscences of Childhood. The memories of childhood have no order and no end. Do Clams Bite began as a single brief anecdote, the account of my first attempt to dig clams. Briefly, here's how it goes. As soon as I was old enough to keep my chin above water in the clam flats of Bolotomy Bay, my big grandfather, my father's father, took me clamming with him. He was a casual clammer who usually wanted only a few clams for dinner. He treaded for clams, walking around in the flats and feeling for the clams with his toes. He walked with a jerky, shuffling step, pushing against the bottom with the balls of his feet. When he felt a clam, he would duck beneath the surface and scoop it out of the sand. He'd bring it up and drop it into the front of his snug wool bathing suit. I watched him go through this routine, filling the front of his bathing suit, then waddling to the boat, his suit distended and lumpy, dumping his catch on the deck and going right back to the hunt. I saw at once that imitating this procedure successfully had something to do with being or becoming a man. But I thought there was a pretty high risk of being unmanned, too. I wanted to ask Grandfather, do clams bite? But I knew that if I asked, he would look at me with his smart gray eyes and know at once why I was asking, and that I'd be embarrassed. So I didn't ask. And instead, each time I found a clam, I pretended that it squirmed out of my grasp before I could get it into my suit. I'd been using this little story effectively at dinner tables for quite a few years. Sentimentalists could release a wistful sigh or two for the innocent little Peter in it, and intellectuals could ride the castration theme for a couple of hours. One evening, early in the telling, just after I'd introduced Big Grandfather and Big Grandmother, my father's large and sturdy parents, the realization struck me that over the years, as I'd told the story, I had distorted the events and characters beyond recognition. It was time, I thought, to strip away the baloney and get down to the truth. The result of my effort to tell it without embellishment, just as it happened, is Do Clams Bite. I'd like to give you an idea of how I went about reconstructing the incident and to point out one or two facts that I may have made up. Consciously trying to revisit the past is a little like trying to see back through a long tunnel, or more accurately, one of those corrugated metal culverts through which streams are allowed to run under roadways. Bear with me through this. The culvert itself is the set of your current prejudices, desires, antipathies, enthusiasms, regrets, and whatnot that restrict your view of the past. You peer through this narrow tube and see only a tiny circle of light, though you're certain that there is more back there at the other end, beyond what you can see. Apparently, just looking won't be enough. You're going to have to crawl through the culvert and see what's back there. If you make it all the way through, you will be surprised by what you find. You will have the odd sensation of being in unfamiliar territory and yet recognizing everything. By crawling through that culvert, I discovered, to my surprise, that I had first begun using the Do Clams Bite anecdote as a boy, just shortly after I'd begun going on the clamming trips with Big Grandfather, and before I was even sure whether clams could bite or not. I was surprised and pleased to find that even in that first telling, I had altered the facts considerably. That first telling occurred one magical night when I sat on the bulkhead along the estuarial stretch of the Bolotomy River at the end of the street where Big Grandfather lived, between two moonlit sprites, Margot and Martha Glynn. That occasion provides the ending for Do Clams Bite, and I have presented it exactly as it happened, except for one or two small adjustments that I had to make primarily for structural reasons. For example, I've represented Margot and Martha as twins, although in fact Margot is a year older than Martha. The reason is that in that moonlight on the Bolotomy scene, I spend some time swimming in the river with one of the girls. When I had them read the manuscript, each claimed to have been the girl described. We spent a long time arguing before I came up with a change that all of us found acceptable. I made the girls twins. We flipped a coin to see which name I would use for the girl I described, and I added a passage that introduces some confusion over which of the girls is which. For another example, I included in that scene a boy named Raskolnikov, whom I have for years considered my best friend, though I knew him only for 2 days at about the time of the events in Do Clams Bite. One day, when I was visiting my big grandparents, I walked to the food market in the center of town to get a few things for grandmother so that she could make some of the coconut candies that I loved so much. On the way, I met a hunted-looking boy carrying a sack. We struck up a conversation, and I learned that he was running away from home because his father and mother simply couldn't get along. His father was an impractical dreamer who had once wanted to build a lighthouse beside their tract home, and his mother was a beleaguered drudge who did all the work around the house, struggled to make ends meet, and often screamed at his father, "Grow up!" As I walked along beside the boy, the possibility occurred to me that he and I might become friends. For a wild moment, I thought of running away with him. Then I thought better of it and tried instead to persuade him to stay in Babington. I thought that if I took him home, my parents would give him some clean clothes and a warm meal and adopt him. He would have none of that. He'd already become a wanderer. He had to keep moving on. He asked me to steal him some fruit and a knife while I was in the market. I had some money of my own, so I bought him some peaches and a paring knife, and I got him a bag of hard candies, too, individually wrapped in cellophane so that they wouldn't stick together in the heat. I told him that I'd stolen these provisions, and I think he was impressed. For the short time that he was in Babington, we were nearly inseparable, although, of course, I couldn't let my parents or grandparents know about him. I did introduce him to my great-grandmother, who lived in a room over Big Grandfather's garage, and it was she who nicknamed him Raskolnikov. He was so taken with her that he gave her the knife that I had stolen for him as a gift, after she had given him $10 to help him along the road. Then he simply left. I've had many other friends, but each seems to offer only part of what this archetypal friend offered, just as each of the girls and women I knew before I met Albertine could offer only part of everything I found in her. Another change from actual fact was prompted by good taste rather than by structure or logic or any of the other considerations that ordinarily influence a writer. I have made 2 of my ancestors, Black Jacques Leroy and his son Fat Hank Leroy, rather tame. 2 more or less harmless businessmen whose interests were limited to beer and poetry. I left a lot unsaid because I knew that if I had dragged in the tales of Black Jacques establishing Corinne's dockside bordello, his liaison with his son's wife, or his role in the Tong Wars between clamming factions, my family would have suffered considerable embarrassment. It was also a question of taste that made me have Fat Hank sell Leroy Lager, although in fact, the brewery is still the cornerstone of the tiny Leroy fortune. The stuff has simply become so anemic that it embarrasses me to admit that I'm connected with it. At heart, though, Do Clams Bite is not about events or people. It is about fear. It's about several boyhood fears. The fear of saying the wrong thing, fear of sex, fear of oblivion, fear of becoming like one's parents, fear of other boys, especially those who carry knives, and most of all, the fear of having a hunk of oneself bitten off by a clam. As a boy, I suffered this fear in silence. Only later did I learn that I had not been the only sufferer. Although this fear was not widespread, many boys in Babington did suffer from it. That group of boys whose fathers or grandfathers were casual clam diggers who went right into the water after the clams, feeling for them with their feet, who wore brief woolen bathing suits, and who stored the clams they caught in the fronts of their suits. By buttonholing school children on their way home, I've learned that many still suffer from this fear. The clam in question, by the way, is Mercenaria mercenaria, the hard-shelled quahog, the pinnacle of molluscan evolution, God's own clam. In other areas, I suppose oysters, mussels, or scallops occasion a similar dread. I don't know. Girls fear for their toes, but in boys, this pelecypodophobia centers, as so many boyhood fears do, on the penis. At clam bakes, I have seen small boys furtively poking at the insides of clams before eating them to make sure that no part of an unfortunate lad is hidden there. Just as I used to poke at clams when I was as young as they and as firmly in the grip of this terror. Once, not long ago, I found myself next to one of these boys at a table full of cherry stones. When I saw him poking at his clams, I leaned over and whispered to him, "Don't worry, they don't bite." I knew at once that he had understood the point of my remark, for he smiled and nodded his head and then laughed a mad, nervous laugh and began wolfing the clams down with horseradish and gusto. Peter Leroy, Smalls Island, July 11, 1982. Chapter 1. From time to time, my parents would take me to stay for a weekend with my father's large and sturdy parents, whom I called Big Grandfather and Big Grandmother, or simply Grandfather and Grandmother. My parents stayed just long enough to fulfill an obligation. They would ordinarily leave after dinner if we went on a Friday, and after an hour or so if we went on a Saturday morning. I would stay until Sunday evening. Though I loved my big grandparents dearly, I was never comfortable during these visits, in part because grandmother and grandfather were so much larger than anyone else in the family, and in part because all their furniture was upholstered with scratchy scarlet fabric, but mostly because, as soon as I was old enough, if the weather allowed it, grandfather would take me clamming with him on Saturday and Sunday. Grandfather clammed in the flats, where the water reached somewhere between his knees and his waist, and somewhere between my waist and my chin. He would hunt for clams by treading, feeling for clams with his toes. When he found one, he would duck beneath the water, bring the clam up, and drop it into the front of his brief wool bathing suit. Soon his bathing suit would fill up with clams, bulging enormously at the front, and he would waddle to his boat, rambunctious, where he would empty the clams onto the deck. I knew that I was expected to do as he did, but even thinking of dropping a clam into the front of my bathing suit brought a stab of pain between my legs. My stomach grew cold and empty. I was sure that clams must bite and that they were likely to snap at me in there. Every moment of every visit was marked by fear of being bitten if I did as grandfather did, and fear of disappointing him if I did not. Each of these visits began with a climb up the stairs to the rooms where great-grandmother Leroy lived, at the very top of the house. I began to move more slowly as I neared the top of the stairs, not out of any reluctance to see great-grandmother, but simply to adjust myself to the pace of things in her rooms. For in great-grandmother's rooms, everything moved slowly. And while downstairs, events marched on toward the time when I would have to go out on the bay with grandfather and suffer through the squirming anxiety that came with the thought of dropping snapping clams into my little woolen bathing suit, here at the top of the house, I would be, for a while, outside the rush of forward motion. Great-grandmother herself had lived so long up here, above things, that she had slowed to immobility and beyond, had begun to move backward, slipping further into the past with each reluctant tick of the old clock that she kept on the table beside her. From my visits, I'd acquired a sense of how this had happened, and my initial impatience during early visits to great-grandmother, to be away, to get downstairs, to be moving, to do something, even to do something frightening, slipped away little by little with each succeeding visit, yielding to an insinuating somnolence, a comforting drowsiness. The longer I spent with her there, the thicker the atmosphere became, as if the room were filling with one of the undulating gelatin desserts my mother was fond of making, and I could relax, stretch out, float, and drift. But always, sooner or later, my mother would call from downstairs, and I would have to say goodbye and descend into confusion and haste. Chapter 2. The door at the top of the stairs was fitted with glass panes from top to bottom, and great-grandmother had hung a gauzy curtain over it. Through the curtain, I could see great-grandmother sitting in a chair by the front windows, where she was always sitting when I came to visit, carving a coconut with a kitchen knife. I knocked lightly, politely, and then turned the glass doorknob. "Hello, Grandma," I said. "Well, Peter," she said. Her voice was small and thin, but strong, and she had a habit of clicking her teeth in the pauses so that she sounded as if she were knitting while she spoke. "Are you here again already?" "Yes, here I am. I came for the weekend." "Are you going out on the boat?" "Yes," I said. I felt my lower lip tremble a bit, but I added, by way of assuring myself that I still had time, that I'd be intact at least while I was here at the top of the house, "I'm going to visit you for a while first." Her rooms were furnished with odds and ends, some from rooms where she had lived before, some just things that grandfather had found here and there, things that had been in other people's rooms, things with pasts that hadn't included her. She didn't quite trust these strangers among her furnishings. When grandfather got her a chaise longue from somewhere or other, she had draped it with a worn rug that she knew well, so that she wouldn't have it staring her in the face all the time. And once she had had me drag a floor lamp into a closet because she didn't like having it look over her shoulder when she read her mail. The only recent acquisitions she felt comfortable with were the gifts of other children who visited her. She had many little friends around the neighborhood, children I didn't know, since at that time I lived all the way across town, away from the water, and so didn't see any of these children at school. I visited only occasionally and didn't have much time away from the adults when I was visiting. Festoons of paper chains hung over every door and window, and her shelves and tables were crammed with tissue paper carnations in juice glasses and jelly jars, paper baskets, necklaces of painted macaroni, and rows of knickknacks made from clamshells. But pride of place went to the coconuts she carved to represent Leroy's. I mean here not the nut itself, the part of the coconut that one buys at a supermarket and belabors with a hammer and an old screwdriver in an attempt, usually unsuccessful, to draw the milk off cleanly before whacking the damn thing to pieces to get at the meat. The nut has a singularly tough and woody shell that nobody's great-grandmother could carve with a kitchen knife. I mean instead the complete fruit, the outer layer of which, the husk, is, when mature, dark brown, fibrous, and easily carved. The carving of these coconuts was a project that she had begun before I could remember, but it was unlikely that it would ever be completed, since she not only kept extending its scope to include more and more distant relatives, but regularly revised the carvings she had already done, working to bring the features closer to what she remembered or supposed them to be. She had completed heads of all the major Leroys that she had any memory of, and was now filling out the ranks of minor cousins and people related only by marriage. She had not yet carved a head of herself. Whenever I visited, she would quiz me about the exploits of these Leroys, and I had gotten them all down pretty well, but there were gaps in my understanding of what I repeated for her, enough gaps so that the Leroy history as great-grandmother presented it seemed to me a perilously leaky affair that was likely to sink if the weather got at all rough. Often, when I was reciting for her, I employed a narrative analog to a widely used technique for keeping afloat a clam boat with a soft bottom, a boat that leaks more or less all the time. One takes the boat out to the clam flats, and there crawls under the hull and pokes sawdust into any visible gaps, and, for good measure, gives the whole bottom a good coating. Then one drinks a few beers or digs a few clams, while the sawdust floats into the cracks and swells with water, stopping, or at least slowing, the leaks. This is not a permanent solution, of course, merely a stopgap measure, but some boats have been kept afloat this way for years. The hull provides the form, the sawdust the substance, and the result is an artful deception, the illusion of a solid hull, an illusion so substantial that the boat floats. Sometimes, when I was reciting for great-grandmother, I threw quite a lot of sawdust into the gaps, but she rarely seemed to notice, or if she did, she didn't seem to mind. Soon, I knew, she would ask me if I wanted a candy. She kept a bowl of hard candies on the table beside her, but the first time that I'd tried to take one, I'd discovered that they were all stuck together. I'd tugged on one, then another, and they'd all come out in a cluster. I'd stood with all the candies in my hand, wondering what on earth to do next. I thought for a moment of smacking them on the edge of the table to break them apart, but I could tell that that would not be the right thing to do up here. So I set the cluster back in the bowl and popped a candy-sized ball of air into my mouth. For the rest of my visit, I made elaborate sucking noises and poked my tongue into my cheek, to make it seem that I was eating one of the candies. The deception seemed to work, but I learned from it a truth about lies. Once we have injected any little lie into our relationship with someone, it has to be maintained. I now went through this candy ball charade on every visit. "Take a candy, Peter," she said. Thank you," I said. "Cherry, my favorite." "Sit over there, by the window." She indicated the wing chair where I always sat when I visited her, an old pink one with an antimacassar. "You're not wearing hair oil, are you?" "No, Grandma." "Your father always used to wear hair oil, and he made a mess of everything. Does he still wear hair oil?" "No." "Do you know which one of these heads is your father?" she asked. "Yes, it's that one." I pointed to the one that she'd identified as my father. All the heads looked more or less alike to me. I distinguished them primarily by location, although I could tell the women from the men because the women wore hats, dusty hats with broken feathers or stained bands of silk. "Very good. Now, which one is Black Jacques?" "The one in the middle of that shelf." "You're a good boy, Peter. What was Black Jacques famous for?" "He invented beer." This was an old routine for us. Sometime much earlier, I'd made this mistake, and it had made her laugh. And so I perpetuated it as part of the ritual of naming the ancestors. "No, no," she laughed, "not all beer, just the best beer." "Leroy Lager," I said. It was a sturdy and honest beer, a drink for sturdy and honest folks. Not like the insipid piss water they try to pass off on people nowadays. Right. And on the back of each bottle was a poem that Black Jacques had commissioned especially for the entertainment, enlightenment, or puzzlement of Leroy Lager drinkers. He paid handsomely for those poems, and they raised the tone of taverns across the land. The period when Black Jacques produced that amber nectar has come to be known as the golden age of brewing. And how well did Leroy Lager do in the days of Black Jacques? It depends on how you look at it. It was a great beer, and it had the finest label in the history of beer bottle label publishing. But sales were disappointing. Rotten, in fact. You can't sell pearls to swine. I knew that wasn't quite right, but it was close. "Oh, that's wonderful," she said. "Black Jacques would have liked that." "So who was his son?" "Great-grandfather, Fat Hank." "Tell me about him." "He wasn't always fat. When you first met him, he was quite the fellow. Everybody's friend. You were just a slip of a girl, and he set your heart aflutter when he tipped his hat to you." "I was young and foolish." "Yes, and by the time you saw him for what he really was, it was too late. That's the tragedy of your life. If only you'd been born earlier, you might have had the father, Black Jacques himself. Now that was a man. Fat Hank wasn't half the man his father was, and he ruined the business as soon as it came into his hands." "How?" "Well, he turned Black Jacques' hearty brew into something so wishy-washy that you couldn't tell it from water, except that you could get drunk on it. and he began accepting flaccid and self-indulgent poems for the labels. In place of a few trenchant and pithy lines on one of the great themes, the Leroy label now offered the anguished sniveling of shiftless egoists whose works were so rambling that some of their poems had to be continued onto several labels, leading to the introduction of packages of 6 bottles and ultimately cases of 24. Well, the result of all this was that after a few bottles, anybody with a regret, a pang, a fear, any weepy drunk could write a poem suitable for the once proud Leroy Lager label. Many more poems were accepted, and the rate of pay for these dropped as the number of poets increased. Sales of Leroy Lager boomed, since poets drink a lot, and every drinker began to consider himself a poet. So, you see, things tend to get worse as time goes by. She sighed and smiled at me with a mixture of sorrow, because what I'd said was so true, and pleasure, because I'd remembered it so well. And what was Fat Hank's reward for destroying everything that Black Jacques had worked so hard to build? He made a pile of money. I looked through the doorway into great-grandmother's bedroom. A picture of Fat Hank stood on her dresser. He was fat, that much was incontestable. Even his coconut was round, with heavy cheeks and a flat base. But he didn't look like someone who'd made a pile of money. He was standing in front of a garage with his hands stiffly at his sides. Behind him was a sign that said, "Honest Service," and to his left was another sign, only partly visible, with a picture of a tire and the words, "Puncture-proof." "Grandma?" I asked, slowly, hesitantly. I wanted to ask her what had become of the money from Fat Hank's watery brew. I wanted to ask her why Fat Hank wasn't wearing white pleated trousers, a sleeveless sweater, and a white shirt, and standing beside a Packard. I wanted to ask why we weren't rich. "What, Peter? Do you want another candy?" No, no thanks. I'm still sucking this one. They last a long time." "Longer than I would have thought possible," she said. "What do you want to know, Peter?" I suddenly knew what I would ask her. The question began to form as I opened my mouth and pushed aside the other questions that I'd thought of asking. It was so big a question that I coughed and sputtered from the size of it, as I might have if I'd stuffed too many hard candies into my mouth. It took a moment for me to recover. "Are you all right, Peter?" she asked. Oh, yes," I said, wiping tears from my eyes. I swallowed my candy, that's all." "This must be quite a question that you want to ask if it chokes you on the way out. Is it about boys and girls?" "Oh, no. I know about that." I didn't, but I thought I was supposed to. "Grandma, do clams bite?" She looked at me for a while, not as I'd feared with disgust, as if I'd asked a question that only a timid little boy would ask, but with surprise and bewilderment. After a long time, she said simply, "I haven't any idea." Chapter 3. Later, as a young man, I went to work as an editor on the staff of the Young People's Cyclopedia. This compendium of useful facts, historical anecdotes, brief lives, practical instruction, oversimplifications, and misinformation was compiled first in a small office above Jack's 24-hour jokes on the corner of Bolotomy and Main in the heart of Babington, and later, when it had become an institution, in a concrete castle, one of those structures that businesses build to show their nostalgia for feudalism, outside town, in a spot that had once been a potato farm and now held many industrial and office buildings and was called, preposterously, a park. The entries were written by a network of experts, amateurs, teachers, and housewives who were assigned topics to develop within strict limits of space. To add a little to the salary I received there, I wrote some entries myself, borrowing as a pseudonym the name of a good friend, Eliza Foote. As Eliza Foote, I wrote many entries in the Young People's Cyclopedia, including entries for most of the Leroys, points of interest in and around Babington, bivalves, and friends and acquaintances who deserved, it seemed to me, a little space on a library shelf. For the entry on Black Jacques, I used some of what great-grandmother had told me, and lots of sawdust. Leroy, John Peter, Black Jacques, 1836 to 1906, American brewer, born Algiers. Among beer drinkers, it is sometimes said of Black Jacques that he invented beer. Although this is not correct, it is arguably true that he developed the best of beers. This was the legendary Leroy Lager, a sturdy and honest drink, relative only by name to the insipid brew later marketed by his son, John Henry Fat Hank. Often credited erroneously with having first marketed beer in pint bottles, Black Jacques did introduce the now widespread practice of printing a poem on a label on the back of each bottle, thus raising the tone of taverns across the land. The period when Black Jacques himself ran the Leroy Brewery has come to be known as the Golden Age of brewing. Sales of the original Leroy Lager were never large, and Black Jacques grew increasingly bitter about its lack of success. Like many another original, he labored under the delusion that something of essentially limited appeal could, as the result of a mutation of public taste, acquire a large and devoted following. In 1894, broken in spirit, he gave the Leroy Brewery to his son as a wedding present. Fat Hank, more in tune with popular taste than his father, began brewing a beer that went down more easily than the original, and he launched a promotional campaign that set an industry standard. He continued to publish poems on the Leroy labels, but required that each poem submitted be accompanied by 6 caps from Leroy bottles, the only requirement for acceptance. At least partly as a result of this practice, the number of poets began a steady increase that has not yet peaked. Another, more or less direct consequence was the introduction of the 6-pack, which put 6 caps into the hands of the bibulous scribbler at once, in an easy-to-handle package. Fat Hank grew increasingly concerned that his success could not last. He calculated that if sales continued to grow at their then current rate, by the end of the 20th century, every person in the world capable of holding a pen in one hand and a beer bottle in the other would be spending every evening drinking Leroy Lager and writing poems. Foolishly, Fat Hank assumed that this was an impossibility. He sold the brewery in a move that seemed like mad impetuosity from the outside, but that Fat Hank, in his autobiography Nobody's Fool, described as the shrewdest decision he had ever made, admitting, however, that his next move fell considerably short of it on the shrewdness scale. He put all the proceeds into a series of service stations cum clam bars. He claimed to have had a vision one restless night of an endless line of motor cars inching along a paved road, each car filled with a happy family eating clams on the half shell. Only a fool, he is said to have said, could fail to see that cars and clams are the coming things. The story of the failure of this venture is a familiar one. Millions are acquainted with the romanticized version that is the basis of the musical film The Flop, and every business school student knows it like the back of his hand, thanks to the lengthy chapter devoted to it in Cartel's basic text, The Big Book of Business Blunders. Essentially, blame can be ascribed to three causes. One, the difficulty of assembling a staff adept at both automobile mechanics and cooking. Two, the incompatible odors produced by automobile maintenance and clam cookery. And three, Fat Hank himself, who, those in the know aver, began to lose faith in his vision as soon as he had embraced it. E.F. Four. When the call came from downstairs, it startled me, although I'd expected it. "Peter, come on downstairs. You'll miss the boat." It was my mother. She always called me in the same way. "I have to go, Grandma," I said. "I'm going to go out on the boat." I waited a moment, hoping that a tear might form in her eye, that she might burst out blubbering, imploring me to stay. Had things ever gone right, she would have said, "I see so little of you, Peter, and we've only covered Black Jock and Fat Hank. You can't go now. I'll insist. I won't let them take you out on the bay. I won't. She would have thrown herself on the floor, kicking her feet and pounding with her brittle fists. Instead, there was a rapid pounding of feet up the stairs, and for a moment I thought my father was coming to tell me that my dawdling was delaying grandfather, to tell me to get a move on, to pull me by the shirt sleeve if I hesitated. But it wasn't my father who burst through the door without knocking. It was a boy about my size, but a little older. His mouth was open, to shout a greeting, I suppose, but when he saw me, he stopped himself. We looked at each other warily, with immediate suspicion. He looked to me like a boy who carried a knife. His hair was light, sun-bleached, and dirty. His face was dirty. His t-shirt and his pants were dirty. He gave up looking me over and he walked to great-grandmother's side. He gave her a kiss, rather a hearty one. That was something I never did because she seemed too dry and delicate. "I have something for you, Lydia," he said. Lydia? I couldn't imagine even Fat Hank calling great-grandmother Lydia to her face. "You do?" she said. "What?" She had become animated, eager. The thought struck me that I never brought her anything, except on her birthday or at Christmas, when I brought her a box containing a gift that my mother had bought. I was usually as surprised as great-grandmother to see what was in those boxes, and I was often embarrassed, since my mother, who never climbed the stairs to these rooms, always bought things that were wrong. "Something you need." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a knife. It was a small paring knife with a wooden handle. On the handle was a small sticker with a price written on it. "You rascal," said great-grandmother. "Where did you steal this?" She'd taken it from him and was running her thumb along the blade. "I didn't steal it," he said. "I swear, I bought it off a kid." "What kid?" "I don't know. Nobody who lives around here. He was just passing through. See, he was running away from home because his father is a drunk and his mother entertains strange men whenever his father's on a toot. So he needed some cash, and I bought a few things off him just to help him out. It sounded reasonable to me. I wondered how old this runaway was, where he slept at night, and whether he'd have to go to school in the fall. Before I could ask, there were other footsteps on the stairs, slower, heavier, and a soft knock at the door. I thought that this must surely be the runaway boy, that I'd get a chance to ask him all my questions, and that this extraordinary appearance would keep me from going clamming with grandfather, since great-grandmother would be sure to insist that I make him some sandwiches and warm up a bowl of chowder. Instead, my father appeared in the doorway. He looked smaller and younger up here, and when he spoke to great-grandmother, his ears turned red, and he looked at his shoes. "Hello, Grandma," he said. "I came to get Peter." "Why, Bert," she said, "I didn't know you were here. Why didn't you come up to see me?" "Oh, I was going to, Grandma. I was going to come up sometime before I left. Right now I have to get Peter downstairs. He's holding everything up." He took hold of my sleeve and started backing toward the door. "Peter can find his way downstairs on his own. Why don't you stay here and talk with me for a while? Look at this," she said, holding the unfinished coconut carving out toward him and turning it so that he could see the profile. "Do you know who this is?" I'm not sure," said my father. Look, I can't stay, Grandma. He looked at me quickly, and for a moment it seemed to me that he wanted me to tell him what to say. "I have to go out on the boat," I said. My father brightened. "Me too," he said. "I'm going out on the boat too." Great-grandmother's mouth fell open. "You?" she asked. "Sure," said my father. "I haven't had a chance to go out clamming for a long time. I usually have so many things to do. This is a real treat for me." 5. My father and I walked downstairs slowly. I lagged behind. This development, my father's going clamming too, made the prospect even worse. My father hated going out on the boat, I knew, because he felt uncomfortable on the water, and he felt uncomfortable with big grandfather, who was strapping, leathery, and salty, who considered any inland work not fit for a man, and considered the work that my father did, managing a gas station, a joke. 6. When my father was a boy, grandfather had bought him a copy of the Boy's Book of Boat Building. In that book were plans for a number of boats that any boy might build. My father greeted the gift with an enthusiasm that made grandfather's heart leap. He got to work on boat building immediately, but his distaste for actually being on the water in a boat led him to interpret the scale drawings in the book as full-size plans, and he built a series of model boats that lined the shelves of his room. Big grandfather was annoyed. He'd wanted to get the boy out on the water. Instead, he was up in his room all the time, making toys. Grandfather went out and bought the lumber for the first of the boats in the book, a flat-bottomed punt of the sort that one might pole in shallow waters. Overcompensating preposterously for my father's miniaturism, he misread the scale in the drawings and constructed, in the side yard, with my father as a conscripted apprentice, a 20-foot punt, which, although singularly graceless, was ideally suited for cruising the shallow clam flats, since it drew very little water. It was not at all suited for crossing the bay to reach the flats, however. It bucked and reared over the smallest wavelets. As time passed, grandfather added to the punt, which he christened Rambunctious, bits and pieces of other boats in the book that caught his eye. There was a cabin from a trim little sloop, blown up in scale so that it almost seemed suitable. He added a large gaff-rigged sail from a catboat and a centerboard enlarged from the plans for a sailing dinghy. He began to feel a facility for improvisation, so he undertook on his own the addition of a gasoline engine, an engine that had once powered a small tractor. The engine was never christened, but he was as surely male as Rambunctious was female. Rambunctious was always referred to as she, and the unnamed engine as he. Starting him with a crank occupied a good portion of the time spent in any of Rambunctious's excursions on the bay. Grandfather kept Rambunctious in a slip on the estuarial stretch of the Bolotomy River, about half a mile upstream from the bay, where many other boats were docked. Most of those on the side where Grandfather kept Rambunctious were working clam boats. On the other side of the river, broad lawns stretched out behind large, comfortable houses. Notched into each lawn was a slip, in some cases covered by a boathouse, that held a sloop or a mahogany runabout, or both. Grandfather was a man of great patience and even temper. Nothing better illustrated these qualities than his attempts to start him. Grandfather had intended that he would make the trip downriver to the bay quicker and easier than it was under sail, but it was not unusual for us to begin an outing in the early morning and be munching our lunch by the time we chugged past the town dock and reached the bay at last. While Grandfather patiently cranked and adjusted something and cranked again, I sat in the stern, dangling my legs overboard, playing a game with the undulating surface of the water. I tried to bring the soles of my bare feet as close to the surface as I could without touching it. It was a game that could not be won. A game that my father would have considered like my chasing kittens on the day that my mother tumbled from her lawn chair. I couldn't win the game because I couldn't know that I'd reached the point I was after until I had passed it. To make matters worse, I included a forfeit in the game on this day. If I touched the surface 10 times before Grandfather got him started, I would brave the clams. I would put some into the front of my bathing suit, just as Grandfather did, and take my chances on their biting. I had already failed 9 times, and he showed no signs of starting. Grandfather had a series of procedures that he'd follow, each of which was more severe than the last. He followed these procedures as predictably and precisely as if they'd been regulations issued by the tractor manufacturer, printed on a little card that Grandfather had put in a black frame and screwed to the cabin bulkhead between his clamming license and Rambunctious's registration. 1. Let him rest for a while. 2. Curse at him. 3. Remove his air cleaner. That's the piece of window screen that keeps any really large pebbles from falling into his carburetor, and try choking him with your hand. 4. Squirt some gas right into his carburetor. It's a good idea to keep an oil can with gas in it handy. 5. Pull his spark plug wire off and clean it with your shirt. 6. Repeat procedures 1 through 5 until you're convinced that stronger measures are required. 7. Change his spark plug. 8. Smack him with the crank handle. Grandfather had already changed his spark plug. If we were to get underway before the water kissed my feet again, he was going to have to get going fast. Hit him with the crank handle, I shouted. Hey, take it easy, said my father. Hitting a machine never does any good. This isn't something alive, you know, it's a machine. You have to respect it. You shouldn't ever take your anger out on a machine. Grandfather snorted and whacked him a couple of good ones with the crank handle. then stuck the handle onto his crankshaft and spun it once. He coughed into life immediately, and grandfather snorted again. A stone landed in the water near my feet, disturbing the surface of the water enough so that it hit my soles. Too late, however, to require me to stuff clams into my bathing suit. I looked around and saw the boy who had interrupted my visit with great-grandmother, the one she'd called Rascal. He was standing on the bulkhead, smiling at me. I smiled back and waved. When I saw him there, I saw also the possibility of having a friend, someone to hang around with. Seeing the possibility, I felt the need for a boon companion, a roarer, a rowdy. I thought of asking grandfather if the boy on the dock could come out clamming with us, but we were already past jumping distance from the dock, and grandfather was never willing to turn back once one of these voyages was begun. I gave the boy another wave and watched him grow smaller as we chugged away. Behind the boy, two suntanned and leggy little girls, blonde girls, so alike that I blinked and rubbed my eyes when I saw them, came walking into view, turning the corner from the street where grandfather lived. They were wearing tiny white shorts and yellow halter tops. When they saw the rascal, they nudged each other and whispered. I knew at once what they were plotting. They were going to push him into the water. He was watching rambunctious, and they were so stealthy that he didn't seem at all aware that they were sneaking up on him. I began making signs to warn him. I tried to be subtle so that my gestures wouldn't attract the girl's attention. I cupped a hand and pointed my finger into it. That was supposed to mean, look behind you. He looked into his hand. I made a pushing motion with both hands. He looked at both his hands. I stood up on the stern and made the same motion. He repeated it. I made a much more exaggerated version of the shoving motion and then took the role of the victim, pantomiming losing my balance, waving my arms in a vain attempt to recover it, and falling into the water. Peter, shouted my father. Hey, Dad, stop. Peter fell in. I was surprised when I came up with a mouthful of water to find that the water was sweet and clean. I looked across the river and noticed a small stream. The tide was going out, and I thought I could see the water from the stream flowing out on top of the receding mix of Bolotomy and bay water. It was smooth, soft, a coat of quicksilver poured over the gray-green and turbid water below it. I paddled around a bit, sampling the water from time to time. I heard applause and found the rascal standing between the girls at the edge of the bulkhead, laughing and applauding me. I smiled and waved at them. Peter, grab hold, called my father. He was holding a crab net out toward me. Rambunctious was still chugging downriver toward the bay, but grandfather had throttled back so that she was barely moving. I knew that this was as close as he'd come to turning back. Maybe I should swim to shore, I said, hoping that grandfather would think that this was a good idea, since he wouldn't have to interrupt his progress toward the flats and the clams. Don't be ridiculous, said my father. Just take a couple of strokes and you'll be able to reach the net. He was right. Reaching the net would be easy. I was able to imagine myself taking 1, 2, perhaps 3 strokes and grabbing hold of the net. I was as easily able to imagine myself doing nothing. I could stop treading water and simply slip below the soft and silvery fresh water into the dark water of this stretch of the Bolotomy, fouled by so many boats. It was the darkness of that lower water and the certainty that the bottom would be a sticky ooze littered with rusting cans that made me decide against letting go. I began to take my strokes, and with each one, I found myself repeating the question, do clams bite? Do clams bite? Do clams bite? There, said my father. I had taken hold of the net without noticing, and he was pulling me alongside rambunctious. He helped me aboard and handed me a towel. I began drying myself. I saw the rascal standing on the dock between the girls, an arm around each of them. I wondered how that felt. He grinned suddenly out of one side of his mouth, and the girls giggled. I felt doomed. 7. I have sometimes had the feeling, since that time, that the future held nothing that I wanted to face, that I was moving downriver toward some equivalent of having to stuff a hungry clam down the front of my bathing suit, and that I would be better off on the whole, jumping overboard and letting myself slip beneath the surface. But the thought of the bottom, the slime, the rusty cans, has kept me on board. 8. I went up to the bow and sat there watching the docked boats, the waterside houses, the flying A station, and the municipal dock slip past. It was always a pleasure, however mixed with fear, to see the bay suddenly open before us when we passed the dock, where boys my age sat fishing safely. It was a clear day, and I could see across to the flats. The flats were a broad expanse of the bay where the water was waist deep or lower for grandfather, depending on the spot and the tide. In the flats were numberless small islands, some just dots of land, others large enough to hold a shack. They scarcely rose above the surface of the water. In fact, what height they had was largely an illusion, since it was composed mostly of grasses, not the sand in which the grasses grew. As much as I disliked the flats at that time, I loved the islands. And as much as I feared clamming, I loved crabbing with grandfather along the network of waterways that ran among those islands. Grandfather slowly, silently rowed Rambunctious's dinghy, while I watched for a scurrying crab along the overhanging edges of the islands, a flash of white in the shadowy water, so quick that I reacted not to the crab itself, but to the memory of it, and darted my net at where it had been, much as I'm rowing the waterways of memory now, snatching at flashes in the shadows. I liked the pace of crabbing, too, the lazy pace, barely more than drifting, and the whispered conversation, which wandered as we did, in and out and around the islands. If, just then, I'd been asked to choose a perfect life for myself, that's what I would have chosen. And grandfather and I would be there now, whispering, barely moving. 9. Of all the islands, my favorite was the largest, Small's Island. On Small's there was an old hotel, Small's Hotel. Small's had, in its day, been quite the spot. It was abandoned now, and it fascinated me. It was exactly where I wanted to live. I knew nothing of its history at the time, and I was embarrassed to ask my grandfather about it, because he was likely to see beyond my questions and realize that I wanted the hotel, the whole island, for my own. 10. Grandfather raised the sails and we began the slow haul across the bay. It occurred to me that a heavy fog might roll in, obscuring the flats, making it impossible for us to find them, impossible for us to clam there. A dark, angry line of thunderclouds might appear on the horizon and bear down on us, and grandfather would have to turn back. Rambunctious might spring a mighty leak, and we would all have to crowd into the dinghy and row to shore. Instead, the day stayed fair, and Rambunctious leaked no more than usual. We arrived at the flats in due time. Grandfather dropped the sails, cranked him up again, and stood in the bow holding the anchor, looking for a promising piece of bottom, while my father took my usual job, holding the tiller steady and waiting for word to kill him. I looked over the side, watching the bottom move slowly toward the stern, unrolling like a story. It was, depending on how I saw it on any particular day, seaweed interrupted by patches of sand, or sand interrupted by patches of seaweed. On this day, it was seaweed interrupted by patches of sand. Now and then I'd see a fish swimming along, a crab crawling across one of the sandy spots, pieces of broken shell, jellyfish, and eel. I always hoped that grandfather was looking for a wide, sandy spot while he stood in the bow, since the sand was much nicer to stand on than the weeds, and I had a better chance to see what was sneaking up on me if it came across the sand than if it came skulking through the weeds. "Kill him!" grandfather shouted. A family 50 yards or so off starboard looked up at this shout. They had a small motorboat anchored in the flats. The father was doing some clamming using a rake. The mother was sunning on the tiny deck forward. 2 children were paddling around in inner tubes. "Okay," called my father. He grabbed a screwdriver and shorted the spark plug lead to the block. He coughed a couple of times and died. I let out a scream and fell to the deck in the cockpit. "What are you up to, Peter?" asked my father. "He's dead," he called out to grandfather. I raised myself on one elbow and peeked over at the family. Father and the children were scrambling for the boat. Mother was tugging at the anchor line. Soon they were planing toward the mainland ahead of a wide white wake, and we had a broad expanse of the flats to ourselves. 11. A digression on the techniques and equipment necessary for clamming. The getting of clams is an ancient undertaking that varies somewhat from place to place and species to species. Of all, the most romantic, the most emblematic of mankind's relationship with the sea, the most persistently attractive mythologically, is the hunting and gathering of the elusive quahog. In Babington, when I was a boy, the methods varied primarily according to the aims of the clammer. The professional, the clammie, took to the bay in a broad-beamed clam boat. Some of the newer ones had been built in basements or backyards specifically for motorized clamming. They were, as a group, homely and unpretentious craft, roughly rectangular, rising slightly at the bow. Placed near the stern was a small cabin, just large enough to allow the clammie to get out of the sun or the rain for a while, to eat his lunch and drink his beer. Others were converted sailing craft, relics of the days when men were men and clam boats had no motors. These broad-beamed, shallow-draft boats had had their masts and centerboards removed and now had engines. A few clam boats of both types had engines that were specifically designed for marine use, but most had marine conversions of engines from worn-out cars. Typically, the engine would simply be dropped into the hull, transmission and all. The exhaust was routed upward through a straight stack alongside the cabin, and a galvanized bucket, the same bucket that was used for washing down the deck at the end of the day, was inverted on this stack when the boat was idle and the engine was off to keep rainwater out. The drive shaft went to a prop, and only first gear and reverse were used. The radiator was eliminated, and bay water was circulated through the block for cooling. Since all clam boats leak, the savvy clammy also made a provision for drawing bilge water through the block and emptying it into the bay, so that the engine bailed the boat while it cooled itself. A simple hand valve switched between bay water and bilge water. I have known many clam boats and owned a couple in which this valve was left permanently in the bailing position. All clam boats had wide, unobstructed decks that ran all around the perimeter of the boat. The clammy would stand on this deck and lower a pair of tongs, or in the technical vocabulary of the profession, sticks, into the water. These sticks could be had in lengths ranging from 8 to 12 feet or so. Their long wooden handles were pivoted near the bottom end. At the bottom of each stick was a sturdy wire basket, and at the very bottom of each basket was a row of sturdy metal fingers or teeth. The clammy worked the handles back and forth, raising and dropping the sticks, opening and closing the basket. Each bite scooped up some sand or muck, shell, weed, and, if the clammy had picked the right spot, clams. By shaking the closed baskets vertically, the clammy could wash out the sand and weeds before raising the closed sticks hand over hand, bringing up the catch, and dumping it on the deck. The clammy would then take a step to the left, or right, if that was his habit, and begin again, so that he would gradually work his way around the deck, and, aided by the slow shifting of the boat and the wind and current, cover a broad section of the bottom pretty well by the time he returned to his starting point. This sounds simple enough, but the subtleties of the art took years to master. Let me give you a single example. A really good clammy could tell just what was in the basket as he shook out the sand and weed. When I was small, I thought that they got their information by weight or sound or vibrations through the sticks. After I'd done some clamming myself and spent some time with real master clammies, I learned that a clammy, working his sticks open and shut, rocking sway-backed in the hot sun hour after hour, standing with his feet apart, shifting his weight constantly on a rolling deck, squinting into the sunlight, rippling on the waves, attains an exalted state of awareness that allows him to see what is in the basket at the bottom of the bay, and that the best of them can not only drop the shells out, but even let the big, tough chowder clams go and keep the small, sweet, valuable cherry stones and little necks. Tonging for clams was hard work, tiring work. Much less tiring, and much more fun, was treading for clams. The tonging clammy worked in the deeper parts of the bay, but the treader worked in the flats, standing in water that was about waist deep. Treading took less skill than tonging. All the treader did was walk around on the balls of his feet, feeling for clams with the toes and the ball of the foot itself. When he found one, he would duck beneath the surface and pull the clam out of the sand by hand. For treaders with experienced feet, judging the sizes of the clams they found was an easy matter. The casual treader, just gathering a few hors d'oeuvres to have with the evening cocktails, might pass up the larger clams completely. But people who treaded seriously, and there were quite a few, would harvest everything. All serious treaders and many casual treaders put the clams they caught into a peck basket that they had inserted into the open center of an inflated inner tube. With this container floating handily beside them, they didn't have to make frequent trips to the boat to empty the catch. My grandfather disdained this eminently sensible contraption. Serious treaders would spend all day at the hunt, so they had to protect their feet in some way. Most used really unattractive gray rubber booties. Both tonging and treading required the clammy to actually go out on the bay in pursuit of the clams. But at the time of my clamming trips with grandfather, a few visionaries were already experimenting with a new method, avoiding going out on the bay entirely and raising clams at home. Since that time, the popularity of home clam farming, in tanks built especially for that purpose, in swimming pools, or even on a small scale in discarded bathtubs, has increased enormously. The main reason, as Porky White put it once, is that there's no size limit on homegrowns. You can gorge yourself on tender little darlings if you want. 12. One more short digression, this time on the sizes of clams. When the day's clamming is over, the clammy culls the clams, sorting them by size. There are 4 sizes of Mercenaria mercenaria in the wild: seeds, little necks, cherry stones, and chowder clams. If you have an adult hand and you close your thumb and forefinger to make an oval, you will have defined the approximate size of a little neck. Little necks are the youngest, tenderest of the legal sizes. They should be eaten as they are, raw, or cooked only very briefly. No one with a sense of the fitness of things would ever use them for chowder. Anything smaller than a little neck is a seed clam, a clam too young to take. The color should throw those back into the bay, but many a clammy will tell you that the little ones go very nicely as a snack with a beer. The shells of little necks have few practical uses, but they're perfect for crafting handsome whatnots to fill the shelves in your living room, and they make nice jewelry. If you form another oval with your thumb and forefinger, leaving a gap this time of about an inch, you will have defined the upper limit of a cherry stone. Cherry stones are good for everything. You can eat them raw, or steam them, or use them in a sauce for pasta. And you can use them in chowder if you're expecting company, elegant company. Tall, slim men in dinner jackets, long-stemmed and angular women in silk. The shells are really a little large for earrings and a little small for ashtrays, unless you're having an elegant little dinner party with the people mentioned above. Most cherry stone shells end up as driveway topping, but quite a few are made into knickknacks and whatnots by people who have somewhat larger knickknack and whatnot shelves than the people who make their knickknacks and whatnots from little neck shells. Anything larger than a cherry stone is a chowder clam, and as its name suggests, it is really only good for chowder, and only everyday chowder at that. Now, everyday chowder is nothing to sneer at, and there are many occasions when it is just the thing. Cold, blustery, rainy days, for instance. Many clam fanciers consider chowder clams the most flavorful, and little necks almost insipid. Others, of course, find the little necks sweet and subtle, and think that a mouthful of chowder clam is a lot like a mouthful of rubber bands. The shells of chowder clams are widely used as ashtrays. At Corinne's Fabulous Fruits of the Sea, one of the places where I conduct my research, Porky White, slurping down a few necks flavored with some pepper and lemon one night, said to me, "You know, they're a lot like women, clams. The older ones are kind of tough and wily, but they've got real flavor. Those in their prime are sort of the standard, the ideal, but since they're what most people want, the real connoisseur generally wants something else. Now the younger ones, well, they're tenderer, and there are times when tenderness is all, but after a few, you find yourself wanting something you can chew on. And the ones that are too young are a guilty pleasure. You know you shouldn't even consider them, but every once in a while, when no one's looking, the pepper must have gotten to him. He broke off and blew his nose in his napkin. 13. Grandfather slipped over the side and into the water. My father stood around with his hands in his pockets, whistling and looking out over the water at the islands. I sat in the stern, with my legs dangling, playing my game with the surface of the water again, hoping that since Grandfather had my father to clam with him, I might go unnoticed and not have to get into the water at all. "Bert," called Grandfather, "are you going to dig some clams?" "Oh yeah," said my father. "I was just looking at the islands and wondering how they were formed. Do you ever wonder about that?" "Nope," said Grandfather. "They probably just started out as sandbars, wouldn't you say?" "Probably," said Grandfather. "And then they grew, little by little." "Guess so," said Grandfather. My father seemed to have run out of things to say about the islands. He began unbuttoning his shirt, slowly. He spotted me in the stern. "Hey, Peter," he said, "let's get a move on. Let's not sit around. I want to see you in the water. You must be quite a little clammer by now." I gave him a sickly grin and started unbuttoning my shirt, more slowly than he. Unbuttoning one's shirt, removing one's trousers, adjusting the string tie on one's little woolen bathing suit. These are tasks that one can't stretch out forever. Eventually, my father and I were ready to get into the water. We let ourselves over the side. I stood near Rambunctious, in water up to my shoulders, watching Grandfather, standing in water up to his waist, shuffling along with short steps, probing the sand with his toes. When he felt a clam, he would duck beneath the surface and scoop it out of the sand. He'd bring it up and drop it into the front of his snug wool suit. Slowly, reluctantly, I began an imitation of his shuffle. I was scared to death, with my father and my grandfather both watching me. Today was going to have to be the day. 14. On my very first clamming trip with Grandfather, I'd watched him go through this routine, filling the front of his bathing suit, then waddling to Rambunctious, his suit distended and lumpy, dumping his catch on the deck and going right back to the hunt. And I developed a deep admiration for Grandfather's sang-froid that has never left me. I'd seen it once that popping clams into one's bathing suit was the manly way of carrying the clams one had caught. But I thought, if the little devils bite, then doing the manly thing may be the cause of my being unmanned. I didn't think exactly that, but I thought along those lines. I wanted to ask Grandfather then, do clams bite? But I knew that if I asked, he would look at me with his smart gray eyes and know at once why I was asking. So I did not ask, and instead I began a half-hearted imitation of his shuffle, worrying all the while about what to do with the clams I found, if I found any. Should I take the awful risk? I'll be unmanned if I do, unmanly if I don't, I thought. Almost at once, my toes struck something hard, something that could only be one of the tasty bivalves. Slowly, resignedly, I took a breath, dipped beneath the water, and dug it out of the sand. I stood up slowly. "You got one," called Grandfather. He beamed at me. "I think maybe you've really got the knack. Now your father—" "Yeah, woo, hey!" I shouted. Grandfather's mouth fell open. He watched me thrashing in the water, rolling around, holding the clam with both hands, twisting, turning. Soon enough, a hefty chowder clam flew from my hands and fell into the water, balloomp, some distance away. "Damn!" I cried, smacking the water with my open hand. "It got away!" Grandfather looked at me for a little while, and I thought he was going to say something. He opened his mouth, then closed it without a word. "It's harder than I thought," I said. "I'll get the next one." I went through the rest of the afternoon without apparently finding another clam. Now, Grandfather was a very savvy clammer, and when he stood in the bow of Rambunctious while we glided across the flats looking for a likely spot, he must have been able to see the clams through the sand, for he invariably picked a spot so loaded with them that I couldn't take a step without feeling a couple. But I rarely admitted finding any that day, and by the end of the day, I was committed to another fiction, harder to maintain than the hard candy one. I was passing myself off as hopelessly inept at clamming. Whenever I did call out that I'd found one, just often enough, I thought, for verisimilitude, the wily bivalve got away. 15. On this day, since my father was clamming too, I thought that it would be a good idea to find a clam early and have it get away, put on a good display of disappointment, throw in a little self-denigration, and see if I could coast on that for the rest of the day, not finding another clam. My father and I were shuffling along side by side, and I'd already felt several clams, though my father showed no signs of having found a single one. Then, suddenly, and with greater glee than I'd seen from him before, he sang out, "Hey, Dad, I got one!" He was smiling like an idiot, I thought. He threw himself beneath the surface and almost at once seemed to be locked in a life or death struggle with something huge and frightening. His legs shot into the air, his feet flailing. Spray shot out from the place where he fought so desperately. Twice he lifted his head above the surface and gasped for breath. At last he stood upright, with his hands still beneath the surface as if he were throttling something. Then, as if propelled, his hands shot out of the water, and from them flew a clam. It sailed through the air and landed, balloomp, in the water, about 10 feet away. "Son of a bitch," he shouted. He smacked the water with his fist. "It got away! I guess I'm no better at this than I ever was." I had seen the clam in the air, followed it in its arc. It was a very young one, probably not legal size. My father and I shuffled around for the rest of the afternoon, but my father apparently never found another of the elusive little devils, and I ignored all the ones that I felt, though the spot seemed to be paved with them. Grandfather brought up a mess of them. He was a master. He snorted quite a bit and rarely looked our way. 16. When we returned home, the house was full of the smell of the coconut candies that Grandmother often made. They were spheres the size of marbles, made of a butter and powdered sugar concoction that was more buttery than sweet, and they were covered with strands of grated coconut. That smell lingered in the house long after Grandmother died. 17. At dinner, my father kept up a rapid chatter, yakking with unusual enthusiasm about this and that. My parents rarely ate dinner at grandmother and grandfather's, and their presence made the evening seem a little like a party or a holiday gathering. May Castle, a longtime friend of my grandparents, who was friendly with my parents too, had been at the house when we returned from the bay, and grandmother had invited her to stay for dinner. May had insisted that she would stay only if grandfather made cocktails, Manhattans. Everyone was in high spirits by the time we sat down, but my father talked and laughed most and loudest. I had caught his volubility, and I filled any gap that he allowed me to fill with stories about my playmates, stories that included plenty of sawdust. These stories rarely went very well at the dinner table at home, since most were of the you-had-to-be-there type. But they were enjoying great success here, especially with May, who laughed uproariously at some and squeezed and tickled me after each. Since that time, I have seen other survivors of near disasters react as my father and I were reacting that night to our having survived the clamming expedition. They go on and on in an uproarious manner. We were eating the clams that grandfather had gotten, fried. "You know, we ought to sell our house and buy something closer to the water," my father suddenly said to my mother. Eyebrows went up around the table. "I really miss it." Grandfather snorted and went on eating. My father got up to get another beer. He usually drank a beer called Bendernagel's Old Bavarian, a beer widely advertised on billboards that depicted a smiling blonde barmaid with breasts like prize-winning cantaloupes, wearing a Bavarian costume, leaning toward the potential Bendernagel customer and pouring a can of Old Bavarian into an enormous crockery stein that miraculously she was filling to overflowing, foam sloshing over the lip and dripping onto an invisible floor. This woman played a prominent role in a series of dreams I'd begun having. You will probably not be surprised to learn that in these dreams I was wearing my little woolen bathing suit, stuffed full of clams, and that I was quite uncomfortable. "If only Fat Hank hadn't sold Leroy lager," I said, or in my enthusiasm shouted, "we'd be rich, and we'd be driving around in a white Packard, and we could buy Small's Island and fix up the hotel and live there." I beamed around the table, expecting that people would jump into my fantasy and that we'd spend a happy hour rehabilitating the hotel and assigning rooms to one another. But only May had any enthusiasm for the idea. "I've spent many a happy night there," she said. "May," said grandmother. May raised her glass to grandmother as if she were toasting something and said no more. From the expressions on the faces of the others, I saw that I'd said something wrong. "Peter," said my mother, "you shouldn't talk about things that you don't know anything about. And even if you do, you shouldn't make fun of people who are dead, and especially not your ancestors." I wasn't quite sure where I'd gone wrong. I had supposed when I made the remark that I was on safe ground with Fat Hank, and that the only risky part was my desire for the island. "What do you know about Fat Hank?" my father asked me. The table was quiet now, and I had everyone's attention. I swallowed once. "Well, he was the only child of Black Jacques, the dashing and swarthy Algerian, who invented beer. I waited the briefest of moments for a laugh, but I could see quite quickly that there wasn't going to be any. Not beer, but Leroy Lager. It was a really great beer, sturdy and honest, not like the insipid piss water they try to pass off on you now. Peter, interjected my mother. And there was a poem on the back of each bottle, I said, trailing off at the end to a whisper. My father burst out laughing, but not as he had been. This was a dark laugh. Where did you get that? He asked. From great-grandmother, I said. My father made a sober face and rumpled my hair. Don't believe everything you hear up there, he told me. You know, Peter, he said, your great-grandmother is pretty old. I know, I said. Of course I knew. Everything about great-grandmother was old. The paint in her rooms, the curtains, and she herself were yellow and brittle with age. The paint cracked in intricate networks and curled away from the wall in places stiffly, in one spot forming the shape of an owl that watched and listened to the talks we had together. The threads in the curtains had grown so brittle that they'd cracked in the breeze. And great-grandmother's hair had become as stiff and brittle as the hair on a coconut. I worried every time she shifted in her chair. I was afraid that she would break, and I'd be blamed for it. Well, he said, speaking as slowly as great-grandmother herself, picking each word carefully, she doesn't remember things quite the way they really happened. She changes things a little. You mean she makes things up? I said. Not on purpose. She just doesn't remember the way they really happened. So she says what she thinks should have happened or what she wishes had happened. Or hadn't, May mumbled. Instead of what she remembers. Understand? Yeah, I said. I didn't believe a word he was saying. May leaned toward me and whispered through a mist of Manhattan. She's not the only one. I do it myself. And kissed my ear. May, said grandmother again. Let me tell you about Black Shock, my father said. He drew a long breath and took a pull at his beer. He glanced at grandfather. When he looked back at me, I looked hard into his eyes and I said to myself, he's going to make this up. May put her hand on my knee and gave it a squeeze. Black Shock, my father said, was a clammy. He was a short, fat man with a black hair and a black beard. That's why he was called Black Shock. He worked hard when he was sober. You have to give him that, he said to the others, turning from me for a moment. Now, as far as beer goes, he was well known for drinking it, and I imagine that he did make quite a lot for his own use. But he was not in the beer business, and there wasn't any Leroy Lager, and Black Shock didn't hang around with poets and that kind of crowd. Well, said May. All right, said my father. In a way he did, I guess. His cronies liked their beer as much as he did, and you will find, Peter, when you grow older, that people start to behave in lots of funny ways when they have too much to drink. Some of them decide that they're God's gift to women. Those are usually the ones who are too loaded to get it up. Bert, said my mother. How do you know that, Bertram? Asked May. Let me speak my piece, said my father. Other ones decide that they're great poets. Those are usually the ones who are too drunk to hold a pencil. So if you like, you could probably say that Black Shock hung around with a lot of great poets and famous lovers. So much for that. Now this beer of his, Grandfather snorted. If you want to get technical about it, said my father, he did put up some beer in bottles, but this wasn't any sort of real business. It was just a guy brewing some beer so that he could drink it with his friends. And these poems that keep coming up, they were just some obscene... Grandfather had been eating throughout my father's talk, contributing only the one snort noted above. He was passionately devoted to the fried clam. He ate them slowly with his fingers, as we all did, for that was the only effective way to eat the clams he cooked, which crunched spectacularly and were likely to snap in two and fly off the table if you tried to cut them or stab them with a fork. Every time I fry up a batch of clams now, following Grandfather's instructions, and sit down to eat them, I take on his single-mindedness. I want to eat through that plate undisturbed, undistracted, undiverted. If Grandfather was asked a direct question while he was eating, we would have to wait until he was between clams for an answer, and even then it would be reluctant and brief. Now, he stopped with half a clam in his hand and half in his mouth, and he said, smiling, with his skin crinkled at the edges of his eyes, "They were great." He meant that to be all he would say, but before he could take another bite of the clam, a chuckle took control of him, and he paused again. "Great," he repeated. "That's a matter of opinion," said my father. "Anyway, it was Henry Leroy, my grandfather, who wound up having to support Black Shock. And in fact, you could say that he had to work from the time he was a boy to support his father's habits. And what did his father do to thank him? That's enough, Bert," said Grandfather, very quietly, as he might have told me that he had seen a crab when we were rowing slowly in and out among the grassy islands in the flats. A silence followed. I looked down at my plate and let my eyes drift out of focus, blurring the food into an unappetizing lump. May ran her hand up and down my thigh, and now and then gave me a little pat, as if to say, "Chin up. This won't last long. It's part of growing up." "Well, anyway," said my father after a long while, turning to me again, "the point is that Black Shock isn't anybody to look up to." He stopped. I waited to find out why Black Shock wasn't anybody to look up to, but my father seemed to think that he'd said all he needed to say. "Why?" I asked at last. "That's something that will have to wait until you're a little older," said my mother. There was a strong tone of relief in her voice, as if she thought it likely that I would never be a little older, and that the matter was therefore, and thank God for it, closed. I was embarrassed. I knew that if it was something that had to wait until I was a little older, it had to be about boys and girls. Being embarrassed made me feel small and powerless. But when I raised my eyes surreptitiously without raising my head, I saw that, except for May, who was grinning, they were all as embarrassed as I. I had no way of realizing then why they were embarrassed. I couldn't have realized, that the boy and girl business went right on being embarrassing when people got older. Only very much later did I realize that this embarrassment was a source of power. Now, however, studying the uneasy faces, I could see that the uneasiness, the embarrassment around the table, offered a little opening for me, a little chink through which, before I started to cry, I could strike a blow for Black Shock, that tall, dark, well-muscled Algerian who was standing somewhere in my mind, holding an overflowing stein of Leroy lager, his arm around the Bavarian barmaid, reciting a bawdy poem. I didn't hesitate an instant, and in my ignorance, I tapped that source of power. When great-grandma was a girl, she liked Black Jacques better than Fat Hank, I said. You said it, burst from May. Peter, go to bed, said my mother. I started sniffling. 18. I did go to bed, upstairs, where I always slept when I visited grandmother and grandfather, in the room my father had had when he was a boy. It was still a boy's room. On the walls were maps of faraway countries and charcoal sketches of boats. A tall bookshelf was filled with boys' adventure stories and aviation magazines. A cupboard and a set of shelves above it were filled with ship models, the models that he'd built from the boys' book of boat building. A couple of these were half finished, as if my father had been at play working on his models one day when there was a knock on the door and someone had barged in, caught him playing, and said, "Stop that now, you're grown up." And he had never returned. I always stayed in this room, but he never came upstairs to visit it. I sometimes thought of finishing the models, but they were too complicated for me then, and they bored me later. The room was in the front of the house, with 3 windows along the front wall above the roof over the porch that ran the length of the front of the house, and one on a side wall facing west. Below the west window, grandfather had built a small desk where my father must have done his schoolwork. Beside the desk was a set of drawers. In the top drawer were a student's supplies, abandoned, old, and useless. Yellowed sheets of paper, a grammar book, pencils with hardened erasers, pens and nibs, bottles that held the dried remains of ink and mucilage. In the second drawer was equipment for adventures, a compass, hand-drawn maps of Babington, the Bay, and the course of the Bolotomy, a code book, several coded messages, a book with its middle pages cut out to make a secret compartment, empty, a whistle, a camera, a telescope, a magnifying glass, and a burnt cork. The third drawer seemed to be filled with a hodgepodge of souvenirs, rocks, shells, postcards, ribbons, newspaper clippings, booklets, badges, and the like. From investigation, however, I knew that at the bottom of this drawer were guilty pleasures, a corncob pipe, a half-empty package of Lucky Strikes, and a dozen photographs of a nude woman. She was at the ocean, romping in the surf, standing at the edge, running into the water, running from the water, throwing sand at the photographer, imitating September morn, sticking her tongue out, striking a bathing beauty pose, lying in the surf, standing with her hands on her hips, toweling herself dry, and finally, holding the towel at her side, draping it on the sand, just smiling at the camera, a little chilled, with goosebumps on her skin, so very happy that my heart leaped each time I reached the last picture. The pictures were clear and sharp. My father had taken a passionate interest in photography for a while. These pictures had been printed with great skill and care. I was in bed, examining the pictures with the magnifying glass. There was a knock at the door. I shoved the pictures under the covers just as the door opened and May slipped in. She was holding a finger to her lips and wearing a conspiratorial look. Her eyes squinted half shut, her brows knit, and her lips pursed. She made a bit of business out of looking over her shoulder into the hall to see if she'd been followed, tiptoeing into the room and closing the door with exaggerated caution. In a napkin, she had some of grandmother's coconut balls. She sat on the bed, spread the napkin, and picked out half of the balls for me. "I'm supposed to be taking these up to your Grandma Lydia," she whispered, leaning close to me, enveloping me in a cloud of Manhattan. "But I thought I'd just stop by and give a few to my favorite, Peter." She giggled and leaned forward and nuzzled me. "Thanks," I whispered, joining in the little conspiracy. She took my right hand and began patting it rapidly. "They're not really upset with you, you know," she said. "Don't you worry. By morning, they will have forgotten all about it." Then she shrugged and said, "Then again, on the other hand, perhaps they won't have forgotten all about it." She snickered and put a coconut ball into my mouth. I chewed and swallowed it while she studied me. Then she held my chin with her thumb and forefinger and turned my head this way and that, examining me with great care. I thought for a moment of offering her the magnifying glass. "There's a little black Jacques in all the Leroy boys," she said. She dropped her hand to the covers between my legs and patted me there as she had patted my hand before. She looked around the room. "Some of them lose it or have it knocked out of them, as if Fat Hank caught them having fun one day and said, 'Stop that now, you're grown up.'" She sat still, rubbing me through the covers, looking at the wall above my head. I was looking closely at her mouth, at the parentheses around it, and at the vertical lines along her upper lip. "I have to go," she said. She gave me a squeeze and left. 19. She was right about the influence of Black Jacques, or of some strain that began before Black Jacques and reached its full flowering in him, but I wasn't sure then just what it meant to be like Black Jacques or like Fat Hank, and I'm still not sure, because they've turned out to be more complicated than either my great-grandmother or my father presented them. I think that big grandfather, sitting silently, eating his clams while my father talked, may have understood them better than any of the others. Or perhaps big grandmother did, for she joined him in his silence, and she ate with great gusto. Broadly, being like Black Jacques means, I think, letting yourself be seduced by your dreams, pursuing them, sending them flowers, and never noticing or caring that people are laughing at you behind their hands, never even quite noticing at last that you've made a fool of yourself. And being like Fat Hank means being ashamed of a dream, sneering at it, pushing it away, abandoning it as foolishness, and having it haunt you, having it leave a cold, empty spot right behind your breastbone, as if you'd swallowed an ice cube when you drained your drink. But the two strains have become so mixed and confused along the Leroy line, if they ever were really distinct, for there was some Hank and Jacques and some Jacques and Hank, that the voices of Black Jacques and Fat Hank sometimes speak to me at once, and I can't always tell which is which. Even my father, who had been so disturbed when he watched the Black Jacques and me pursuing the kittens on my mother's parents' lawn, still had a little of Black Jacques in him. I'd seen it, though I hadn't recognized it for what it was at the time, after my parents and I left my mother's parents' house and moved into a little house of our own, one of 36 nearly identical houses thrown up one summer in the northwest corner of Babington, on a piece of land that wasn't good for anything else. My mother wanted my father to finish a corner of the attic as a bedroom for me, All she wanted was 4 plasterboard walls and a solid floor. My father began working at night on plans for the room, and on many nights he worked on into the morning, leaving for work late and red-eyed, rushing off without breakfast. But he was smiling, and the house was full of excitement. Late at night, when he finally put his pencil down and went to bed, he and my mother would wake me with their laughing and squealing and jumping about. He began to whistle. At last, one evening after dinner, he spread the plans out on the kitchen table for us to see. The room he planned would fill the whole attic, from one end of the house to the other. The attic stairs would be torn out. I would reach my room by climbing a rope ladder from the kitchen, and in the morning, I would slide down a fire pole to the hall outside the bathroom. A model railroad would run completely around the perimeter of the room, through mountains, alongside a river, and through a miniature Babington that would fill the corner that my mother had thought would serve as the entire bedroom. Painted on the walls behind Babington would be the bay, the clam flats, the islands, and the sea and the sky receding to a thin, precise horizon. Painted on the floor would be a chessboard where I would be able to play living games with my playmates in the neighborhood. At the center of the room, a helical staircase would lead to the top of a lighthouse that would grow from the center of the roof like a cupola gone mad. I would be charged with the responsibility of seeing that it was always lit at night. My mother and I were ecstatic. It was a magnificent conception. I would become, in a stroke bold beyond anything that the neighbors might have dreamed, the envy of all the kids on the block. The 3 of us dragged a stepladder to the roof and set it up with its legs on either side of the peak, just where the lighthouse was going to emerge. We took turns steadying it for one another so that we could stand on the top step and look out over the lights of Babington, the bay, the flats, the islands, the sea. It was breathtaking. On the following weekend, my father bought a case of beer and assembled a crew of friends, and they cut a circular hole in the center of the roof. Storm clouds gathered, and there was a high-spirited scramble for tarpaulins and tents that they patched together to cover the opening. While the rain fell, my father and his helpers drank the beer and studied the plans. I could see that my father was already the envy of all his friends. After a while, since the rain kept up, the friends drifted off, and Black Jacques, thinking that there was a pretty good chance that they'd be stopping at a tavern, slipped off with them. Somehow, while the door was open and no one was looking, Fat Hank got in. My father went upstairs with the plans in his hand and stood under the canvas, listening to the drumming of the rain and shaking his head. He worked every evening during the next week to close the hole and patch the roof. And on the following weekend, he put up plasterboard walls in a small corner of the attic and laid a floor of linoleum tile. This corner became my room. Once, later, at night, when my parents were out, I put a ladder up to the back of the house and climbed it to the roof. I walked to the center of the roof and stood where the hole had been, on my toes, looking out toward the bay. 20. When May had gone, I took the pictures out from under the covers and bent over them with the magnifying glass. In the pictures, May was quite a few years younger, and there was no sign of the vertical lines along her upper lip. I could see the parentheses around her mouth, though, and a spray of lines shooting out from her eyes, because she smiled so much. But the closer I looked, no matter how much I tried to persuade myself that I was wrong, that the shadows were deceiving me, the more I had to admit the truth. May had no penis. I wished that I had had the nerve to ask her, while she'd been sitting with me, how she'd lost it and whether it had hurt. But I wouldn't have known how to console her if she'd broken down in tears, and it may have been the certainty that if she did break down in tears, I'd be blamed for it that kept me from asking. Still, she was so happy in the pictures, running in the surf. If she'd been hurt, she'd recovered. On her face, I could see a kind of joy that couldn't be faked. These were not pictures of someone who was making the best of a bad deal. She was happy. Maybe, I allowed myself to think, it didn't matter all that much. Maybe it was no worse than losing a tooth. 21. Whenever I began to go to sleep after a day on Rambunctious, the bed in my father's room would toss and roll, replaying the trip down the river and across the bay. Sometime before I reached the flats, I would usually be asleep. But that night, shortly after I passed the town dock, I heard a scratching at the window screen. I lifted my head and found myself looking into a boy's face flattened against the screen. His nose was bent to one side and pressed white, with dimpled squares of flesh projecting through the interstices. His lips were curled into a snarl, and he was holding his hands beside his ears and clawing with his fingers against the screen, playing the part of a large white-faced cat that would go for my throat if it could get in. It was the boy who had burst into great-grandmother's room, the one she called Rascal, crouched on the roof over the front porch. Recently, when I read to him the foregoing description of his snarling at the window screen, he said, "I think I realized even then that making friends is an odd and delicate business, full of opportunities for disaster, for losing face, and for rejection. At some point, in some way, you have to declare your intentions, to say, 'I like you. I want to be friends.' This is much harder than to say, 'I love you,' because friends give up much more to each other than lovers do. I suppose that's why few lovers are friends. I'm certain that's why making friends, for many boys anyway, often begins with a threat. The boy needs to establish antagonism as a base from which to build the friendship, so that if anything goes wrong, if the possible friend laughs at his name or catches him in a lie, he can fall back on the antagonism and pretend that he was only kidding about the friendship." That may be, but it struck me at once when I saw him that he'd come to make friends. He pulled his face away from the screen and smiled. I opened the screen, and he climbed through the window onto the bed. "You're Peter," he said, "right?" "Yes," I whispered. I was fascinated by the grid left on his nose and the side of his face by the window screen. "My name's Rodney," he said. He paused a moment. He was looking at me with unblinking eyes. "You think that's funny?" "No," I said. "I think it's the stupidest name I ever heard of, and so does my father," he said. "My mother thought it up. But nobody calls me that anyway. Everybody calls me Raskolnikov. It's a mouthful, isn't it? My uncle started calling me that on account of the haunted look I have. What do you think?" He clamped his jaw and tipped his head downward so that he was looking up at me, his eyes glinting from deep hollows. "It's the name of a character in a book, a real son of a bitch, carries an axe." He stopped to let that sink in. He was chewing gum. Anyway, everybody calls me Rascal. Oh, I said, that's what Grandma called you. Yeah, he said, your great-grandmother. She's a peach, isn't she? Yeah, I said. I tried to sound as if I agreed enthusiastically, but I wasn't sure that I liked having this fellow call my great-grandmother a peach. In fact, I wasn't sure that I liked his knowing my great-grandmother well enough to have decided that she was a peach. Things were not off to a very good start, I thought. Still, I'd decided that I liked him, and I wanted him to like me. Move over, he said. I got somebody else with me. Is it the boy who sold you the knife? I asked. The one who ran away from home because his father is a drunk and his mother is an entertainer? He probably needs a place to sleep. We can put some blankets on the floor and fold up some towels to make a pillow. Did he have any lunch or dinner? I could probably sneak down into the kitchen later when I'm sure everybody's asleep and make him some sandwiches. He had started to turn toward the window. Now he turned back toward me, but he looked to one side of me, and the dimpled squares on his cheek reddened. He said nothing. I felt like a fool, a naive fool, a little boy next to this little man. Why hadn't I realized that the runaway had been stitched up out of whole cloth and stuffed full of sawdust? Why hadn't I kept my mouth shut? I suppose that I looked wistful and disappointed, for I felt that I'd lost the chance to make the right impression on this fellow, who would have made so good a friend. I was trying like the dickens to think of something clever to say that would get both of us out of this awkward spot, get things moving again, but I couldn't think of a thing, and the moment seemed as if it would freeze as it was and become one of those damned moments that persist and persist, rising from the memory now and then like heartburn. But then Rascal's face lit up. For an instant he seemed about to grin, but then he tightened his mouth. He shook his head resignedly. Oh, him, he said. Nah, he's gone. Now there was a haunted character. I really felt sorry for that kid. I know how you feel. I felt the same way you do about him. I figured that if I brought him home, my parents would probably give him a warm meal and then adopt him. But he wouldn't have any of that. He just wanted to keep moving. I never even got his name. That's a shame, I said. A real shame. And I was grinning from ear to ear, and so was he. It was going to be all right. Anyway, he said, I brought somebody much better than him. I brought these two sweeties. He leaned out the window and hissed. The two girls that I had seen sneaking up behind him on the dock appeared, and they climbed through the window and onto the bed. 22. I'm 37 years old now. Margot and Martha, the Glynn twins, who climbed through the window that night, are now 39. Rascal is 40. The events that I've been relating took place early in the summer after I had finished the 4th grade. I had skipped the 3rd grade, and my birthday wouldn't come until the fall, after the school year had started. So I was, when the Glynn twins came through the window, not yet 9. I'll let you work the rest of the ages out for yourself. If we had been clams, you would have had to throw us back. I followed the 3 of them out the window, along the porch roof, and down a maple tree at the far end of the porch. As I slid along a branch that overhung the porch, light from the living room fell on me, and through the window I could see my grandparents sitting on the scratchy furniture, reading. We walked along the road to the river, and along the river to Rascal's father's clam boat. The night was warm. Clouds slipped across the face of the moon. Rascal began undressing as soon as we reached the clam boat, and I saw that we were going to swim in the river. He was in the water quickly, and I wasn't far behind. The tide was out again now, so the soft, sweet water from the stream flowed out over the dark bolotomy. I turned onto my back and watched Margot and Martha undress on the flat deck at the stern of the boat. Two shadows against the white cabin, bending over, sliding their shorts down to their ankles and stepping out of them, grabbing the hems of their shirts and shooting their arms upward. Then the clouds moved aside, and for a moment before they dove into the water, everything glowed with moonlight, the sumptuous skin of the water like pewter, and Margot and Martha side by side before the fluorescent white cabin. Two smooth sprites, their hair as soft and bright as the moonlight, and between their long thighs, no penises. Their dives were sleek and silent, and they swam underwater quite a distance before coming up. During the time that they were underwater, I figured it all out. They were girls. May had been a girl. They had all been girls from the very start. I understood the whole thing, more or less. A head rose out of the water next to me. Her features, their features, were still just sketches of what they would eventually become, except for their large eyes, their large, watery blue eyes, and their long lashes. "I'm Martha," she said, just so that I'd know. She already had the unsettling habit of looking steadily, unblinkingly into my face with those lovely, wide, incredulous eyes. We were treading water, looking at each other, and that steady, doubtful look made me think, as it has so often since, that she was waiting for me to say something, that she probably wouldn't believe what I said, but that she expected me to say something and wondered why I hadn't come out with it yet. So I came out with it. "I like the way you look," I said. We swam in the river for a while, paddling around, talking, whispering. Whenever a car went by on the road that ran along the water, we clung to one of the boats and to each other, hiding in the shadows. Incidentally, she would place her hand on the small of my back and apply a little pressure to guide me into the shadows. I would put my arm around her waist and hold her close to me, because in her shimmering reflection I thought I'd seen her shiver. After a while, our hands began to wander, and soon we had pretty well satisfied our curiosity. We swam across the river to the mouth of the stream, on the side of the river where there were no clam boats, where a large house stood back from the water, separated from it by a trim lawn. Rascal and Margot were there, and the four of us stood up in the stream. Even in the shifting light, I could see how very alike Margot and Martha were. "Let's go up this stream," I said. "I want to see where it comes from." "You can't go very far," said Rascal. "It runs between these houses, and then you come to the street." He was right. Whispering and giggling, we walked along in the stream bed, the water barely up to our ankles. Willow trees grew on either side, and the stream was so narrow that their branches mingled and hung in a tangle overhead. We could look into the lighted houses as we passed. We hadn't gone far before we came to a metal culvert, hardly large enough for us to crawl through. "See," said Rascal, "there isn't much to it. I've been through here, but it's a tight squeeze, and it's not worth squeezing through. You know what I used to think when I was little? I used to think that this stream came from another world. My brother told me that. He told me that he'd crawled through the culvert once and come out in another place like this, but different. Different in a way that he couldn't explain. He made a lot of noise about how I was probably too scared to go there. So one morning I crawled in, and I was scared. I've never been so scared. I could see some light way down at the end, and I thought that must be the other world. So I started getting excited and I crawled along faster on my hands and knees in the water. When I got to the end, I thought I'd made the biggest discovery anybody ever made. There it was, right there in front of me, this other world that looked just like this one, but a little different. I had to sit down because my heart was pounding so hard. When I got my breath, I started exploring around, and what did I find? The other world was exactly like this one. There were houses, just like regular houses. There was a Bolotomy River, just like our Bolotomy River. There were clam boats, just like real clam boats. There was even a clam boat just like my father's clam boat, and on it there was a guy just like my father, wiping his nose on his sleeve the way my father does. It was spooky. There was something wrong about it. I can't explain it, but I knew I didn't want to stay there. So I ran back to the end of the culvert and crawled back through. And when I got back out, I felt safe again because I was back home. We had started back down the stream and we walked along quietly for a while, pondering the implications of Rascal's story. Then Margot spoke up. Our father used to tell us something like that, she said. We used to race to be the first one out the door to play, and we'd wind up squeezing through the door side by side. He wanted to get us to stop racing for the door by having us take turns being first. So he warned us that every time we squeezed through the door side by side, we would change into each other. Martha would become Margot and Margot would become Martha. If we wanted to stay who we were, we'd better start going through the door one at a time. We believed him too, said Martha. He told us in such a serious voice, as if he'd just noticed what was happening and was worried about us. We spent almost a whole night trying to figure out how many times we'd already been through the door side by side so that we'd know who was who so far. In the morning, we decided that it didn't make any difference so long as neither of us wanted to switch. So we never squeezed through the door again. We giggled at that while we swam across to Rascal's father's boat. While we were dressing, Margot and Martha turned those unblinking eyes on me, and I thought I should say something. That's nothing, I said. My mouth began filling again as if I'd taken too many of great-grandmother's hard candies. I swallowed hard and went on. When I was little, I used to think that clams could bite. I laughed uproariously, and they chuckled a little, tentatively. I would go out clamming with grandfather, and I would stand in the water, watching him shuffling along. When he felt a clam, he'd duck under and bring it up and drop it into the front of his bathing suit. He'd keep dropping clams in until his suit was all lumpy, and then he'd waddle over to Rambunctious and empty them onto the deck. I knew he wanted me to do the same thing, but I was sure that the first one I dropped in there would bite. I hesitated a moment. I didn't quite have a word for what I wanted to say. Me, I said, using a word that came closer to the essence of my pelecypodophobia than I knew. I wanted to ask him, do clams bite? But I knew that if I asked, he'd figure out why I was asking and know that I was afraid. So I didn't ask. I just did what he did and hoped that all the clams I caught would be asleep. Well, I caught a lot of clams, and none of them bit me, so I figured it out for myself. Clams don't bite. Girls are just born that way. I have often wondered, of a Sunday morning, what imp made me say the things I said on Saturday night? As soon as my last sentence was out, I wondered why I had said it. I blushed, and they laughed. Rascal clamped a strong hand on my shoulder and said, I knew I was going to like you the minute I saw you fall into the water. The next audiobook in the series is Life on the Bolotomy, in which Peter Leroy recalls a childhood journey of discovery that he made from the mouth of the Bolotomy River to its source, traveling with his best and imaginary friend, Rodney Rascal Lukachnikov. The journey begins with the work of turning a packing case, which Captain Andrew Leach intends to use later as a coffin, into a shallow draft boat. It involves encounters with a philosophical vagrant and a gaggle of beautiful nymphs. And it ends with the metaphor of life as a river turned on its head.